Welcome everybody back, man. We are just hitting battlefield after battlefield. We've been to Fort Henry, we've been to Fort Donelson, we've been all around Shiloh and Corinth, and here we are at a place I hope you've heard of, Parker's Crossroads, Tennessee. This is a battle fought on the last day of 1862. I'll bet you may have heard of another battlefield. You may have already seen, I can't quite tell, some of our videos from that other battle. We won't talk about that now. We're talking about Parker's Crossroads. I hope you've also heard about a famous quote that might have been uttered here by one Nathan Bedford Forrest. So we're going to talk about what brought the troops here, talk about the Battle of Parker's Crossroads, maybe move around once while we're here. But before we do, let me bring on, the Trust has no better friend in Tennessee than this guy right here. Good guy as well. Steve McDaniel, 30 years in the State House of Representatives here in Tennessee and is really interested in and ancestrally connected with this battlefield. Come on, Steve. What do people what should they expect to see if they come to Parker's Crossroads?
Well, I'll tell you, we've created quite a park here, and we're really proud of it. It's 370 acres, has over 4 miles of paved walking trails. We have a visitor center where you should begin your visit, and then we have a self-guided driving tour, or if you're lucky, you might talk someone into giving you a personal tour of the battlefield. So we're proud of what we have here at Parker's Crossroads, and we think that anyone who visits here really carries away a good understanding of the activities, the events that took place at Parker's Crossroads.
Good. Thanks so much, Steve. And I'm gonna switch the camera with Chris in just a second, but this is really interesting. You look at it on a map, and many people might think Parker's Crossroads destroyed because there's an interstate and a highway coming through here. But we would say, as you stand here today, I can't see any of those things. Maybe compromised, but not destroyed. And in fact, there's hundreds of acres to see here. So pretty cool stuff.
Now, I-40 traverses through the center of the battlefield, but if you had to have an interstate come through, it came through at a good place between the Union and Confederate lines here at Parker's Crossroads. So it's very well interpreted because the interstates here doesn't hurt the interpretation or your understanding when you come of this battlefield.
Yeah, it's a beautiful battlefield, and Steve, I'm going to set up just the high-level things, and we're going to let Steve start walking us through this battle. And we were driving down the Union line here, which is just a beautiful spot today, which was once, he was saying, a truck stop area. They have cannon out here, caisson, limber chest. You also have reproduction cannon, and then as you drive along, you have the fence line that the Union Army would be behind, a reproduction fence line. And then we drive up this hill, and we come right onto the Union flank, and we find the position of Nathan Bedford Forrest's artillery. So it's a pretty beautiful sight out here. But to get to Parker's Crossroads, let's just take a step back or two. If you remember earlier in our trek, we've been to Forts Henry and Donelson, and we talked about Abraham Lincoln wanting to get all of his armies moving by February 22nd of 1862. The idea is to try to take the war to the Southern Confederacy and try to prod some of his generals to get moving. Men like George McClellan, Henry Halleck, but men like Andrew Foote and Ulysses S. Grant will start picking up that ball and running with it. Now, here we are. We're in December of 1862. We're about 11 months removed from those earlier campaigns that we talked about. And now, Abraham Lincoln is kind of back at square one saying, guys, we got to get moving. We have to get moving and taking this war to the Southern Confederacy. Jump back to September 22nd, 1862. Lincoln has issued the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. January 1st of 1863, one day after the battle here at Parker's Crossroads, he is going to sign the Emancipation Proclamation. So to give it a little bit more emphasis, give it a little bit more backbone, he is going to try to start sending Federal Army south in the winter of 1862-63. So if we look in the Eastern Theater, we have Ambrose Burnside, everybody's favorite hard luck general to talk about, the shortest tenured commander of the Army of the Potomac at just 77 days. He's going to march down to Fredericksburg and meet demise there on December 13th, 1862 at the Battle of Fredericksburg. So the first prong of Lincoln's offensive does not go well. The next prong of his offensive will take place same time as this battle here at a place called Murfreesboro or Stones River, depending on what side of the war you're on. And there will be a fierce battle. In terms of percentage of casualties, that will be the highest percentage of casualties between two Union and Confederate armies of any battle in the war. We'll be visiting there later on in our trip, and you'll learn more about that, so I won't get into too many details there. Then we're going to have this guy called Grant trying to move down towards Vicksburg, Mississippi. So as he's trying to move down towards Vicksburg, open up the Father of Waters so it can run unvexed to the sea, that is the Mississippi River, Grant is going to try to start moving down towards a place called Chickasaw Bayou. Things do not go well there for Lincoln's war effort either. But in the midst of this, there's another moving part. Joe Johnston and Jefferson Davis, the president of the Confederacy, and Joe Johnston, the Western Theater commander, they're going to talk, and they're going to start to talk about moving troops through Middle Tennessee and into Mississippi, and the idea is to start disrupting the Union supply lines. You'll hear names like the Lothario, Earl Van Dorn. You may have heard about him if you watched our Corinth video earlier. Van Dorn is going to move on Ulysses S. Grant's supply base at Holly Springs, a very famous Holly Springs raid, and do something like $1.5 million in damage there whenever he moves off towards Grant and kind of strangles there. Then you'll have a guy named John Morgan. We call him today John Hunt Morgan, but during the war he's called John Morgan. Morgan is going to move off on a raid towards Nashville, and then you're going to have a raid here with a guy named Nathan Bedford Forrest. 1,800 troopers will be coming with Nathan Bedford Forrest across the Tennessee River at a place called Clifton. He will cross the river, and he is going to start riding into the rear of the Union forces and start threatening one of those Union rail lines. And the Union commander in the area is actually going to start calling all of his men back into one central point, or at least most of them, and Forrest is going to be able to wreak havoc, as he's pretty good at doing, in through Middle Tennessee and through Tennessee. So he's going to be doing a lot of damage himself. So there's a lot of Confederate raiding parties going out. We have major armies moving at the same time. And even though this is going to be one of those battles that make Nathan Bedford Forrest very famous, it's actually a campaign he never wanted to undertake. He was actually against coming out here towards a place called Parker's Crossroads. He is going to think that it's a bad idea having to cross the half-mile wide Tennessee River, ride into the rear of the Union forces, and having to do it during wintertime with men who weren't, some of them were well-trained, some of them not so well-trained. Some of them well-armed, some of them not so well-armed. But as he rides along, he's going to create havoc and eventually arrive here around Parker's Crossroads the same day the battle at Murfreesboro is starting to take place. So, Steve, it's a lot of information for folks. I went from the 50,000, let's take it down to the 500 feet. You know, what's happening here, boots on the ground, December 31st, 1862?
Well, it was after a very successful raid that Forrest ends up here at Parker's Crossroads. He has delayed Grant's what results in a 3-month delay of his supplies and troops down the Mobile and Ohio Railroad. He encounters the federal troops here on the morning of December 31st, 1862, and they are seeking to block his escape. All Forrest is interested in at this time is to escape safely back into Middle Tennessee and recross the river at Clifton. It's here on that morning he meets Colonel Cyrus L. Dunham's infantry. After a 2-hour battle, he pushes them back to Parker's Crossroads and eventually south of the crossroads. Then he begins to surround Dunham's brigade. And so a fierce battle ensues at that point. Forrest is using his artillery very successfully on the on the federal lines, and then it's that later point in the battle when he thinks he has everything under control that he gets surprised by Colonel John W. Fuller's Ohio Brigade that comes into his rear.
Thanks, Steve. Let me just jump in real quick, because there's a lot, you summarized it there, there's a lot happening here, right?
Yes.
In the meantime, Forrest thinks he has this thing won, right? Or at least wants to make it so. He's encouraging Dunham to surrender, not once, but twice, and Dunham doesn't like being asked to surrender. You go back and tell him that I'm not going to surrender. What's going on there?
Well, Forrest has split Dunham's brigade into two groups. One is south of the other group. One group is along the fence line, and I don't guess their walkie-talkie radios were working. They couldn't communicate with each other. And Dunham didn't know that his men along the split rail fence line was surrendering. And so he refused to surrender, but what Dunham was holding out for, he knew he had the Ohio Brigade that could come in and save the day for him.
That's great, Steve. And we're going to go over to that part of the battlefield. This is a large battlefield. Some 400 acres practically are preserved here. But let's orient things a little bit. Chris has been putting up some maps, but let's bring on another Chris Mackowski here, who's going to orient us a little bit on the battlefield. Chris?
And I just kind of want to tie back to something that Steve had mentioned a second ago, because this battle takes place to the northwest of town, and we're standing kind of on the opposite corner of the battlefield from that. And Forrest starts by opening the battle up there, and here we're still at a Forrest position. Can you maybe just sort of explain a little bit about how, how we're oriented on the battlefield and how Forrest's men end up all over the place like that?
Well, what Forrest did, he sets his artillery up in the northern part of the battlefield, and the Federal Brigade is behind this split rail fence. Well, Forrest begins to flank the Dunham's troops on either side, and the position we're in right now is where one of Samuel Freeman's artillery batteries was located, and they would fire across the field here into the fence line and enfiladed the line, thereby being very, very effective in his attack and use of his artillery.
Good. Thank you, Steve. So what we're going to do here is actually relocate, okay? This, if you look at Parker's Crossroads like this with the State Tennessee Highway, I think it's 22, and the interstate here, we're over here. We're going to go about a half a mile across the interstate, north and west of here, often where the direction the camera's looking over there. We're going to pick up this story. But before we leave, what's happening here is Forrest is in pretty good control. He's overlapping the Confederate flanks. It's not looking good for the Union, but they have a surprise in store for Forrest.
Yes, they do.
Okay, good. Well, anything else to add, Chris?
Yeah, I would just add, this is a stereotypical Nathan Bedford Forrest move. He's massing his forces, hitting very quickly, very hard. We'll hear about the 9 principles of war later on with Parker Hills at a place called Bryce's Crossroads. Unfortunately, we don't have Parker at Parker's Crossroads. But what's happening here is that Forrest, he is using his men just like he always does. He'll dismount some of his men to keep a holding action while he starts coming around the flanks of these Federals, and eventually they find a beautiful hill that is overlooking the Federal line, utilizing his artillery. He's very effective, so it's always that hard-hitting aggressiveness, taking the fight to the enemy. Even at times when he probably shouldn't be doing it, he is going to catch that enemy off guard, and that's what's happening here. In fact, after the battle, one of the Federal commanders is going to say that the Confederates had 8,000 men attacking them here at Parker's Crossroads. They had about 1,800.
And there you go. So I'm buying time so Chris can grab back the camera and do what he has to do to hit cut here. But, and these things are going to serve Forrest well at Straits Raid, at Hog Mountain, the legendary Hog Mountain, and elsewhere. He didn't need more men to make you surrender to him. So this is classic Forrest, like Chris said. Thanks, Steve. Thanks, Chris. Thanks, Chris. We're going to pick up in what seems like just a second on video, but it'll be about 10 minutes for us. Thanks. Hey everybody, we've just moved less than a half a mile from those woods behind me, a little bit to the northwest, over to near the site of the Parker House and Parker's Crossroads proper that are behind the camera over here. We're going to keep talking about the battle here because this was Forrest's game until right about now. Steve McDaniel?
Well, we're standing in the middle of what was then a cotton field. And at this point that I'm going to describe, Forrest has surrounded Dunham on 3 sides. Well, in behind Forrest, to his great surprise, came Colonel John W. Fuller's Ohio Brigade. They begin coming across the field, and someone comes up to Forrest and said, "General, the Federals are in our rear." Well, he can't believe it because he'd sent out scouts that morning to watch for the approach or impede the Ohio Brigade's approach. So he rides across the field to the Parker House area and sees for himself, yes, there's Federal infantry walking around over there. And one of them puts his gun on Forrest. I mean, he's right there with him. And he says, General, I demand you surrender. Forrest, being quick-witted, a quick thinker, he says, well, I've already surrendered. My men are forming up out here now in the cotton field, and we're going to stack arms here at this man's, Parker's house, at his woodpile. Well, they just let Forrest ride off. He comes back over here to the area we're in now, and an officer comes up to Forrest and says, well, what shall we do, General? He said, we'll charge them both ways. So basically that's what he did. Nat Baxter was nearby on his mountain howitzer. He says, come on, Baxter, I want you to go with us. But Baxter says, well, General, you know, I have neither pistol nor sword. And he says, that don't matter. He said, I just want to make a big show as possible. So he takes his men, some accounts say 75, some say 125. He charges across the field toward the Ohio Brigade, long enough to take them off of offense, put them on defense, and he begins to pull his men and artillery, which most of them he's able to save. He pulls them off the field and escapes around on the right flank of General Dunham. So that concludes the Battle of Parker's Crossroads once Forrest withdraws from the field.
So before I let you go real quick, Steve, what are we talking about for casualties here? Is this a massive battle? I mean, I know this is classic Forrest, but what are we talking about here?
Well, we have a hard time determining all the casualties. We know that there were at least 30 men buried right over here on the Federal line. Somewhere between 300 and 600 casualties would be my best guess. And then you had Forrest had captured a lot of the Federals, but when Forrest leaves the field, he leaves 300 men on foot whose horses were being held in the rear of the Confederate lines, and that was the first thing to fall into the hands of the Federals, were those cavalrymen's horses, where the cavalrymen had been out on the field on foot supporting the artillery. Their horses had been left behind, and they were captured along with those 300 men. And Forrest had to leave the field, leave his dead and wounded on the field just so he could escape.
Good. Thanks, Stephen. I don't know if we're going to solve this thing today because, usually when a commander, even Forrest, when you leave your dead on the field, when you're the first one to leave and you suffer more casualties, that's not usually called a victory. But usually Parker's Crossroads is known as a Confederate victory. Forrest, he made good on his raid of Tennessee. He brought off the things he collected during that raid. So let's talk a little bit more about the aftermath. I'm going to bring Chris Mackowski back on here. What did all this mean?
Well, of course, this has a huge chink in the growing myth of Nathan Bedford Forrest, because as he continues to have events like this in the battlefield, his reputation grows, and it's going to help add to that sheen of invincibility that he has, that then carries on, of course, well after the war into the modern day. The second implication really ties back to the larger Confederate command structure at this time. Joe Johnston, who had been in charge out in Virginia till he was wounded at Seven Pines in May, Jefferson Davis needed to give him something to do, and he assigns him to command of the Western Theater in November, and Johnston does not want it. He thinks Davis is setting him up for failure. He comes out here to the west. He's told to make his headquarters close to Murfreesboro, but wherever you find it most convenient. But he's also in charge of the army that's down in Vicksburg, and that's why Johnston doesn't want this, because his forces are separated by far too much distance. Davis tells him, no, you'll be fine. In fact, Davis comes out in December. They go down and tour that part of the Johnston's command down in Mississippi, and Johnston's really, really nervous about this. Well, then by the end of December, this event happens, which proves Johnston's fears correct. His forces are spread out geographically too far to help each other, to be able to mutually support each other, and now we've got Forrest running around between them, stirring up all sorts of trouble. This is going to cause huge problems for Johnston and the Confederate command moving into 1863, because it's going to make Johnston a super reluctant commander. That's going to play out in terrible ways during the Vicksburg campaign.
Oh, good. And as you're watching that, sound off onto whether you think Johnston is naturally endowed with being a super cautious commander or whether that's a result of these things. That's really cool. So here we are on this battlefield. You might be able to hear the roar of the traffic. There's an interstate right behind the camera. There's a state highway right over there in that direction. And some people say, oh, this battlefield was lost. Well, tell that to the people at Mackowski. Tell that to the people at Cedar Creek and Fisher's Hill and Newmarket, where there are also interstates and sometimes highways running directly through the battlefield. I completely disagree. Anybody who stands here knows that you can have a meaningful experience at this battlefield, especially when you have a few things: preservation, restoration, and interpretation. And these things don't happen by accident. This is the result of federal, state, and local and private donations making this happen. Tennessee is one of the few states, and it's a lot in part thanks to this man I'll bring on in a second, Steve McDaniel, who is able to have one of those states that has a fund that will help to match preservation funds. So as you get the letters in the mail, partly federal funds, partly state funds, trust members make up the difference. That's why you have an 8-to-1 match sometimes, including on the land that we're standing on right now, which you helped us and the Parker's Crossroads Battlefield Association to be able to preserve. So this didn't happen by accident. I want to ask Steve just two things. A, what did I leave out? And B, what does this mean to you, looking back 20 years when none of this had happened?
Well, I tell you, Gary, we never dreamed that we could have this much preservation going on, but now we see the potential with the help of the state, the Battlefield Trust, and other people. We're able to acquire either through conservation easements or fee simple purchase land. We've had 11 acquisitions here that has brought us 370 acres. We have a visitor center where you should go and start your visit. If you can come when it's open 7 days a week, to take the self-guided tour and then the walking tours that we have available.
Good. And I just want to say that walking around here, we can't possibly show you everything, but there are cannons here, there are limbers here, there's great signage here, there are bathrooms here, there are benches here with umbrellas on them, there are rail fences, there are numerous cannons to mark the location. So again, this only happens when, government, private entities, and nonprofits work together to make this happen. You can have a great experience here.
Yes, and we're so happy to have this group here today to help expose what we've been able to accomplish here at Parker's Crossroads, because we're so proud of the result of all the combination of efforts of people involved to get us to the point where we are today.
All right, well, I can't say enough about this man right here. We have no better friend in the state of Tennessee than Steve McDaniel, and all the tireless work that you and all the staff at the Battlefield Visitor Center have done and everything. So thank you so much for joining us today, for all you've done. To Chris Mackowski, Chris White, I'm Garry Adelman. You're with the American Battlefield Trust. Get inspired at battlefields.org, and thank you for your support.